Okay, so this is going to pick up where we left off on the prior video. I've got a couple things to take care of. I believe my tab index is not correct on these. So text box, tab index 0. This one's also 0, so I'm going to make it 1. Box, tab index 2 is fine. Add button 3, clear button 4, 3. Those are the same because I just copied the control. I also need to change the default, the style on the drop-down to be a drop-down list, and that'll stop it from acting kind of like a text box. Okay, so we're going to look at the events. So after you've added events, which we've done in here, the behavior when you double-click out here is going to be different. It will just position you at that event rather than adding an event. So if you don't have an event handler defined yet for the control, double-clicking the control is going to give you, it's going to add the default event handler for that control. If it already exists, then double-clicking it is simply going to position you at the event handler. So that's what it did here. So as I mentioned in the previous video, these event handlers have this code duplicated. And we're going to consolidate that. So you can see that these controls are all wired up to their own event handlers. So whether it's text box 1 goes to text 1 text change, text box 2 goes to text 2 text change, combo box, they all go to their own event handlers, and that's what's causing the code out here to have to be duplicated. So what I'm going to do, also let me mention one thing. This is important. Every method, so these are event handlers because they handle events, but they're also just methods. That's just a method. It's just wired up to an event on a user interface control, so it actually gets called an event handler. So it makes sense to call them event handlers, but they are just methods. So methods have a name, they have a return type, and they have a set of parameters. Those things, actually the name is not included in it, but so of course they all have names. But you've got a method with a return type and parameters. If the return type and the parameters are the same across these events, you can actually consolidate them to a single event handler. That's referred to as the signature of the event. These events all have the same signature, void and these parameters, an object and the event args. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this top one. And I'm going, now this one's not happy because it's now the second one with the same name, but I'm just going to say, I'm going to change the name of this one to be UI changed. Okay? The user interface has changed, and that's maybe too general a name. Nothing's calling this yet, but if I go over here in the designer, I then, in this properties window under events, it's going to look for all of the methods in the form that have the right signature, that are qualified to handle this event. So now I've got this new one. It's actually just a method, but now I'm going to make it an event handler by wiring up the text change event on text 1, the UI changed. Then I'm going to do the same thing on 2, and then on the combo box, it also has the same signature, so I'm going to use that. So if we go back in the designer code, the place where you normally don't need to go, you can see that these text boxes and the combo box are now wired up to UI changed, and I don't need this code anymore. These are no longer called, they're basically abandoned event handlers, and now I've just made my code quite a bit more concise. So all of my events now are handled by this one event handler. So that's redirecting multiple events to a single event handler. And that keeps you from having to write and maintain duplicated code, which is always a good thing. There's also no reason we have to default these to false. I mean, it's totally fine because that's going to be the state of it, but you can actually reuse this logic at the startup time too. Just copying and pasting. So there you go. So that's kind of one step in the right direction. Now, I like, let me just say something about this kind of if logic here. So this logic works so long as there's not a blank space in the text box. So just because you can't see, we'll just run this and see if I can get this behavior to the problematic aspect of this to be demonstrated. So I'm going to type in just an A, and then I'm going to select that. And now our add is enabled. And if I eliminate this, now add is not enabled. But if I do A space A, and I come over here and I backspace 1, get rid of that A, and then I put my cursor before here and I delete it, you can't see it, but there's still a blank there. And this condition is not valid for the add button to be enabled. Okay, does that make sense? If I remove that space, then the length of this string is indeed 0. But if I put a bunch of spaces in there, that's not a valid condition for adding. So, because of that, this is not the best way to handle is my text box blank. So what I like to do on those, because this ends up becoming very reusable, is I'm going to go ahead and add a new file. Let's see, we'll add a new class. We're going to add a new class, and we're just going to call it extensions. And we're going to add into this extensions class some extension methods. And it has to be public and static. And then I'm going to add an extension method, public static void, boolean. And I'm going to call it is blank. And an extension method always takes the word this, then a type. I'm just going to call it S. Okay. And we'll return false, is not blank as a default condition. So an extension method has to be in a static class. It has to be a static method. It uses the keyword this to indicate that it is a extension method. I don't entirely know why, but unless you have this in here, it won't be considered an extension method. And this refers to the object that is being called with this extension method. And we'll see how to use that in a second. This is the data type. And this is the variable name. So what we want to do then is we're going to go over here and leverage this. Instead of saying is the length greater than 0, we're going to say is blank as an extension method call. But is blank isn't really what we're after here. We're wanting to know if it's not blank. So we can do this, right? And that's acceptable. But we're going to change that in a second. So if the text 1 is not blank, if not is blank, it's the same thing as is not blank. So we'll do the same thing here. If not is blank, and this is going to end up being fine. The selected index works there without ambiguity. We saw that the text length is an ambiguous type of test. So let's go finish up our extension method. So is blank. We can say if s equals null, return true. Because a null string is essentially equivalent to a blank string, an empty string. There are other ways of writing this code, and I'm sure you'll see those as you go forward. There's some string class methods that do the same thing, but they're longer, and I'd rather write less code. So I use these extension methods. So if it's null, return true. Also, so we won't get to this line of code if it's null, right? We're going to be exiting this method with the return statement on line 13. So we won't get to here. So at this point on line 14, we know it's not null. So you can say if s, and then you could put the length 0 in here if it's true. But we still haven't handled the problem with embedded spaces, embedded blanks. So you can do this. You can say s.trim.length equals 0. This will eliminate the blank spaces and will ensure that the only characters remaining to be evaluated for the length are non-blank characters. It'll trim the string down to eliminate beginning and ending non-blank characters. It won't take out non-blank characters in the middle, but obviously if there's a middle to be had, there has to be characters that exist, and you're not going to be blank. So this gives us a way to know whether the string is null, not null, includes blanks, doesn't include blanks, all gets wrapped up into this very simple extension method, is blank. Now, it's handy to have the opposite. Public static bool is not blank. To find out the opposite, because it's the condition here, not is blank, is spread out across the two ends of this statement. It's much better if you eliminate those and then just have an extension method that reads is not blank and it's having a little trouble with it because this method is not finished over there. But this reads so much better than not is blank. This is not blank. So in the extension method, we'll implement this, and we could basically write the opposite of this code, but we don't need to. We could say if uh, you know you basically if it's null, return false, or you could just do the opposite. But here you can just say return not is blank. Oops, you got to do I'm sorry, should have had this stuff in here. Um, because it's not an extension method without that. So now I can do so what this does, it basically says do the opposite of is blank. And therefore this code basically calls this code and flips the Boolean from true to false and false to true. So these extensions, along with other extensions you make to a string class or any other class you want to make extensions for, become your code that you can use everywhere. And you probably remember from the code I wrote at Gulfport, we made extensive use of this isBlank extension method. And I'm going to see, I think I've got my billing workbench up. So this is One Therapy Network code. And you can see in my org.js library, I have all different types of extensions that have become my framework for working with dates, for working with strings. So here's my strings. You can see all this is code that I don't ever have to write again because it's my library of strings, of string extensions. So in here, I've got is not blank, and I've implemented it a little bit differently. So here, this is a different way of writing a method. So this basically says is blank. This right here becomes the method body and just evaluates to whatever this is, true or false. So don't be disturbed by the different syntax. If there's multiple lines of code and if there's logic, you can't do this kind of method implementation. But if it's just a single line of code or something that can be connected by ands and ors, you can do this. I forget what they call it, but it's you don't need the brackets and the body of the method. You just can write a single line of code that evaluates to true or false. Here I can't do that, so I actually have the curly brackets and a body. So the point is you can build these extension methods into an assembly that you use broadly in your software, and you end up having an easier time writing code. So here's your first two extensions if you do that. And certainly I'd be happy to share any of those with you, but it's good to kind of build them yourself because you recognize the need and you implement it and you use it. It kind of becomes your own. Okay, so here's the extension methods. And then, so this to me reads more English-like than testing the length, and implementing the is not blank method along with the is blank method gives you an English reading kind of code rather than having to negate the is blank. So up here, we just do the same thing. Dot is not blank. Get rid of the logic there. We're calling those extension methods. And so this kind of cleans up your UI. So the changes we made as we consolidated the event handlers into this UI changed. We implemented extension methods, and now we're using them here. And that's important because you don't want to be going into the whatever logic you're going to do with the add button when you don't really have valid code. An empty, blank, um, text box is not valid. So you got to protect it from not just checking the length, but all the stuff that goes on in these is not blank extension methods. You don't want to implement, is all that out here. You want to push it back into your extension methods and leverage it with just a very simple extension method call. Makes your code easier to read. You have to write less code. You implement the logic to do that in one time. You don't have to do it for every single text box. You just leverage the extension method. Okay, so that's that. The program doesn't function any different than it did before, but now you've made your code, you've consolidated it, you've used, um, there's fewer places for errors to occur. There's fewer places to change if you've got changes you want to make. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. I encourage you to make these same kind of changes in your code, and we can talk more about next steps once you get your user interface behaving the way you want to.